Thank you, Simone, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming back after this lunch. While walking to lunch in this cold weather, it somehow made me think that it's definitely advantageous to sort of travel horizontally. We at least know how cold it's going to get, And well, we're all back. Thank you so much, Hildegund and Sabine and the Summer Academy for this invitation. It's a real honor to be able to share the panel. In the last day and a half, we've seen so much go past this table. It's nice to sort of come on board and take off from the amazing set of ideas that both Nancy and Gerardo have put on the table this morning. I rarely actually write papers, and I sort of find myself far more comfortable talking from notations. And when Babel's mail came that we needed a full paper for the sake of translation, I was kind of a bit caught off guard, not having done this for a while. But so if I do look a bit stifled and disoriented, because when I see all this text, I'm a bit disoriented, I apologize in advance. But let me sort of start reading some of the things that I just wrote down sitting on a studio window. Primarily just putting down some questions and also some recollections, thinking back of the time that I know back in India and the kind of moments that I can recollect as the points of contact with the global. As our title of our session says, what is the relation of global art to regional developments, global local interdependence. So I'll probably go back through recollections. So I'll just start reading. Is the art object GPS coded by default? Is it embedded with a geotag, and can we cite which part of the globe it is coming from? Despite the fact that the artwork is essentially a warehouse of the artist's deep investment in a place and time, a theme and an ideology, how is the embedded metadata of its creation, such as location and time of its making, ideally unraveled by the viewer participant? Do artworks deserve a certain kind of location neutrality so that they're not domesticated or incarcerated by the superimposition or an overemphasis on the sort of socio-cultural backdrop of the place where they come from? And does this apply across the board for art that comes from any part of the world? If not, does this create some kind of a viewing asymmetry when it comes to seeing art from certain places vis-a-vis others? In other words, if we pick a catalog of the kind of exhibition making that's become quite popular these days with large institutions, which is now being called the survey group exhibition. And normally these come out of places as India, China, Iran, etc. And if we look at the aspects of the exhibition, such as the exhibition title, the graphic design, publication design, or sometimes even the text that accompany the project, we often see that artworks get propelled with a certain form of assisted reading through the foregrounding of a certain kind of local information that then becomes the sort of overall framing device for the artworks in this project. Of course, it is counterproductive to ignore this kind of local specificity and to create some kind of a flattened, universalized kind of discourse. So, that would be highly counterproductive, and one isn't suggesting that. But are artworks from certain parts of the world more susceptible to a form of over-summarized and hurried prefixing of local specificities, whereby they are granted a kind of compromised global mobility through a projected provinciality? So does this become this kind of, does the artwork gain its mobility through this framing, which is a kind of complex sort of thing that keeps popping up? I'm reminded of the fade-in publication Fresh Cream, Contemporary Art and Culture, to which both Maria Lind and Gerardo contributed, which was actually a gathering of 10 critic curators choosing 100 artists. And it was also called the Biennale in a book form, a kind of Biennale that can sit on a shelf. And I find that, especially Fresh Cream, very interesting, and for the time it came and the kind of content, and especially the e-conversation that went on between the curators. And I'll just sort of quote Gerardo from there. Fresh Cream still unconsciously bears certain ethnic inflections in its subtitle, Contemporary Art in Culture. Why not just contemporary art? The ghost of anthropology can appear as soon as one moves away from the mainstream. True internationalization cannot be put together through mainstream agents, no matter how democratic, following a north-south axis. A true global diffusion and evaluation of culture is only possible through a multi-directional web of interactions. This has come up a few times in the conversations. We are urged to organize South-South and South-North circuits, able to pluralize what we understand by international art language, international art scene, or even what is contemporary. It is necessary to cut the global pie, not only with a variety of knives, but also with a variety of hands, and share it accordingly. Close quote. Since all art at its moment of conception is the result of a prolonged gaze and a deliberate form of looking on the part of the artist, I wonder if we can trace the genealogy of that gaze. How does an artist anywhere in the world develop his or her own way of looking? Can the dialogue about the local and the global and their sort of dynamic interpenetration be carried to the very complex site of the artist's gaze, the prologue sort of gesture, the probing gesture that germinates an artwork? Or do we think about this question in a sort of less esoteric fashion, by talking about the predicament of our times that we've been discussing in the morning and earlier as well, the speedy sort of nomadic forms of viewership that keeps up with the rapid movement of art across borders, and the readministration of art's meanings that occur as it journeys through varied national borders and institutional spaces, and all the attendant side effects that this process has on every other process of the discipline of contemporary art today. Anyway, let me diverge a little from these trail of thoughts and arrive at the sort of question that's handed to us this afternoon, which is the relationship between the global and the regional developments. And like I said, I'll go back to recollections and think about my early days in art school. I passed out of art school in the sort of early, sort of mid-90s. And my education primarily, was at the Sir J.J. School of Art, which was founded in Mumbai in 1857. This was also the year of the Indian Mutiny, which is often called the first Indian war against the British. So they were formed the same year. And it offered a wide range of work from the European Renaissance and modernism, as well as many traditions of India and the highly engaging work of colonial India, such as the company school. The artistry could be described as a mix of H.W. Jansen and H.H. Arunasan, mixed with Ananda Kumaraswamy. So there's this kind of, balancing that the education provided. My first year in art school was also the year of India's liberalization. The tentative embrace of the global and the rapid acculturation that followed were ironically paralleled simultaneously by the ascent of a religious fundamentalism and the birth of a right-wing rioting politics. I was 18 then, and somehow the art education that I received hadn't prepared me to fully grasp this complex sort of backdrop. It was only in retrospect a couple of years later that I felt how this peculiar moment when India was trying to sort of ventilate itself culturally, only to be simultaneously held hostage by the politically stirred up history of its volatile past, was central to my thinking about art. Talking about the sort of art scene that I first encountered on leaving this art school, the year was 1997, and age 23, I was invited to this exhibition called Innenseite, which happened in Kassel, Germany, with an emphasis on Asia, Latin America, Africa, and primarily the non-Western world. This was my first overseas exhibition and my first trip out of India. So it was like this local Mumbai boy taking his first flight straight from campus to an exhibition that was framed as a collateral event to the Documenta 10, Catherine David's Documenta 10. The main humble site in Untitled was a former police academy, just a couple of blocks from Castle City Hall on Friedrichshaberstrasse. The exhibition outreach material stated the motivation of doing the project as follows, and I quote, "The starting point of our project was with the question, what is contemporary art and culture today? How do artists from different countries express themselves culturally?" So it was framed in a sort of contrarian position to the documenta. It was meant to be a gathering of all the others, in a sense. And to me, in retrospect, this project exposed me to how deeply invested some of the invited artists within documenta were about the whole idea of exclusion. And much of the discussion about the documenta that happened in that conference was essentially from the lens of us, them, center, periphery, and their own sense of being excluded from the canon of Western artistry and the dominant institutional discourse. Like I said, I was arriving straight from my art school campus, armed with an adolescent sense of inquiry, and it somehow mattered less to me, these themes of exclusion, than some of the older counterparts in the exhibition. Nevertheless, this was my first exposure to an image of the metaphorical global pie that Gerardo was perhaps referring to. This is also how I first encountered hands that felt disqualified from possessing a knife or having the access to have the tactile sense of cutting that global pie. This was 5 years after Jan Hewitt's Documenta 9, when already sort of discussions about inclusion of artists from the South had begun. And the sort of visible absence of non-Western artists in Catherine David's edition was also a point of much discussion. For instance, her statements such as the documenta is not the United Nations, or I quote from elsewhere, from a German magazine, Art, "It has now become fashionable in the art world to invite artists from Africa and Asia. This is for the most part an alibi gesture, the best case conformism, and just simply colonialism," close quote. And it was interesting to go back now and sort of look back at those statements and to also think about, say, for instance, 10 years later, Chinese artist Ai Weiwei arranges the travel of 1,001 Chinese farmers, laid-off workers, street vendors, students, rock musicians, white-collar workers to visit the German town of Kassel and be part of Documenta 12 as part of the artwork titled Fairy Tale. I'm neither pointing to this piece as an exemplary artwork, although I find it interesting in many ways, nor am I citing it as what becomes logistically possible for an artist from Asia to do within the framework of an exhibition such as the Documenta. I point to this sort of long-distance performance picnic that takes place with this sort of vast movement of audience, to think alongside, our discussion about the local and the global, and also the idea of spectatorship and how that whole notion gets kind of performed through the movement of audience, which is also artwork. This moment of 1997 back in India, we were 5 years into liberalization, and we had suddenly transitioned from a two-channel nation run by the state to a kind of 90-channel cable TV nation within a very, very short span of time. Although the first television program was broadcast sometime in 1959, the expansion of television in India did not take off until the popular telecast of the 9th Asian Games, which was held in Delhi in 1982. It is often said that the 1991 Persian Gulf War, which was inadequately covered by the sort of state-run channel Doordarshan, created an urgent need for news, and this was known only through a few cable dishes, which was mostly attached to hotels. And there was this sudden sort of, young, small entrepreneurs who sensed this kind of a need and started sort of flinging cables, across apartment blocks, rudimentary cable head ends were set up on their garages and homes, and sort of linking up neighborhoods through this sort of informal network that began sort of organizing itself in the next 2 or 3 years thereafter. So the International came flooding into one's living room with BBC, CNN, and MTV, beaming breaking news and music videos, plugging urban India into the reservoir of global culture. A universal lexicon of images and ideas began to unsettle the established glossary of national science, disturbing identity stereotypes and injecting a potpourri of new ideas, new desires, tastes, and mannerisms. The somewhat monotonous Doordarshan channel, run by the state, had to bear the assault of the uninterrupted amusement spectacle systematically bombarded from the cannons of the international entertainment industry. Returning back to the moment of 1997, I think of 2 exhibitions, one being Tradition Tension, curated by Pinan Poshananda in 1996 and presented simultaneously at the Asia Society, the Grey Art Gallery of the New York University, the Queen's Museum, and featuring the work of 27 artists from India, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea, and Thailand. China remained missing from this list for some reason. But up until then, most of these artists hadn't really interacted together. And it was really at that point, when I look back, that I began to see a link between artists of a generation older than me having direct contact and emergent collaborations that took place, out of these encounters. The other exhibition was Cities on the Move, curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Huan Ru at the Vienna Secession in 1997, which then followed to 6 other venues and countries in the course of the next 2 years. The project, which was a gathering of artists, architects, urbanists, took as its impetus the change, the flux, and the move of Asian cities on the threshold of the 21st century. I cite these seminal exhibitions here as both in their separate ways pressed for a reimagination of the continent, one by connecting the contemporary with the past, and the other by placing the present in an ever-evolving relationship to its projected future. One of the key sort of developments that took place at this moment was the formation of the artist initiative called Khoj India, which was an artist workshop project, an artist-initiated workshop project. Khoj was the offspring of the Triangle Artists Network that was formed in 1982 by Robert Loder and Anthony Caro, bringing together artists from UK, US, and Canada. In 1991, with the formation of the Bag Factory in Johannesburg, this triangle had become a quadrilateral, and as more collectives were formed, the network became a polygonal chain of artist-initiated workshops and residencies. Following the Khoj model in the region, Vasal Artist Collective was formed in Pakistan in 1999, Tirtha in Sri Lanka in 2000, and Brito in Bangladesh in 2002. This formed a hugely generative space of peer-to-peer exchange and approbation across the region. And in some ways, it kind of broke the inertia of each of these countries sort of working in their own sort of seclusion, with really no contact except for the kind of contact that Gerardo was talking about, which always connected to the north. I think as far as the sort of short story of this sort of regional exchange with the global goes, I think I'll sort of stop here and pick the threads in our conversation. But I thought I'd share a sort of set of images. And these are actually just 3 works that I made. In no ways are they illustrative of the dialogue that we've been having or of the paper or of something that I've said. But I thought that perhaps through these 3 pieces, which were made across a time frame of close to a decade, and in some ways all 3 of them sit on the outskirts of what my work otherwise looks like, because primarily a lot of my work is to do with imagery. But these were just 3 works that connected to text and historical text. And I thought I might just cite them and see how the sort of excursion of one's thought happens through one piece of work to the other. So can I sort of switch on the... so, I should move up maybe. This was a piece called Public Notice, and a piece I made in 2003. It was also a peculiar moment in India. Sorry, it's also a peculiar moment in India that several of us felt sort of incapable of comprehending. We've seen through the 90s the rise of a certain kind of a right-wing sort of rioting kind of politics, which sort of culminated in some ways with a somewhat unpredictable kind of genocide of sorts in the state of Gujarat. And several of us within the sort of artistic sphere felt a sense of inadequacy. And I, in some ways, felt that perhaps the answers to some of these lay in foundational texts of the nation itself, and began going back to the texts of the formation of the nation. And the piece, Public Notice, sort of refers to the speech that Jawaharlal Nehru delivered at the midnight of Indian independence. At a time when the nation was formed and there was this notion of euphoria and also hope, but also at a moment when a part of the continent was being separated from its body with a moment of partition. And in some ways what we saw with Gujarat and this kind of a reincarnation of the wounds of partition essentially sort of took me to these words of Nehru. So in a way what happens with this piece is essentially a rewriting of that text. It's almost like a clerical recital of Nehru's words, where I write them on these almost like 5 sheets of paper, which are essentially a reflective mirror. With a kind of inflammable adhesive, and setting each alphabet aflame as I write. So it's at once an evocation that becomes almost like a cremation of the words. And in some ways it's through the act of burning that this kind of invisible text, because as one writes it with the adhesive, it's almost not visible, and as it burns, it becomes visible, but also warps the surface of the mirror through the burning, and sort of becomes one with the surface. This was first shown at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Mumbai, and thereafter it's been seen in various venues. And essentially the closer one gets to the text, the more it sort of it splits the image in front of it. So essentially the image of the viewer then gets sort of distorted and split in Nehru's words. This was in 2003, and it was around the same time that I received an invitation to be part of a project that Ranjit Hoskote, who was here in the morning session, was a curator of. And it is a show called Under Construction, which was also called New Dimensions of Asian Art. And it looked at, and as the exhibition graphics and it shows, it sort of imagined Asia as a sort of work in progress, as a continent in the making. And this was curators from 6 countries and artists, essentially as part of the project. And this was also a time when I was kind of feeling somewhat demoralized about the sort of fragmentary nature of what was sort of breaking down in India, and sort of that was at the back of my mind very much at the time of this invitation. And the project that I have is actually on the website of the exhibition itself. So it remains kind of like a web project within the information masthead of the exhibition. So when we sort of scroll down, under the Under Destruction page Under Construction page is a link that says Under Destruction. And as one hits tab, it sort of, this is a kind of image that pops up, and one is urged to kind of download. And as one downloads, it creates this set of images which are somewhat ominous looking signs of fingers pointing at each other, blood drops, bomb blasts, skull and bones, tragic emoticons. And a pop-up asks us to change the font to any readable font such as Times Roman. So it's actually a Microsoft Word file on the website, and you kind of change the font and it becomes the Indian national pledge. India is my country, all Indians are my brothers and sisters. It was purely this text rendered in the font Wingdings, and one could sort of go back and invert really what sort of emerges from a kind of collapsed national pledge. And this is a text that one grew up as a young boy memorizing, on the every first page of a textbook, etc. This sort of hyper secular text rendered through a first person account of what India means to oneself. But the reason I cite it here is also of the sort of fragmented nature of what was going through my own system in a sense at that point in time. Because this was also the moment immediately after 9/11, and many of us received this kind of viral emailing, where the font of NYC, if changed to Wingdings, would become this. Or if you have a flight number and you change its font, it becomes this. And so this was, hugely circulated, kind of inducing a notion of the paranoia, but a notion of also some sort of premonition in all of this. And actually this flight number was not the correct flight number. It's been some sort of a fearmonger, has sort of altered the flight number to match an image. And then it kind of goes through this global circulation. And so at one level, one was looking at this material really that comes out of this this global response to a certain moment. But then, in a sense, that started deviating into something else, essentially the text of the national pledge that I was sitting with, which then, in a sort of perverse manner, was kind of inverted to the same font that comes out of this somewhat meaningless and absurd global email circulation. And I just bring this up as, as some sort of thoughts from that moment. The other sort of emails that some of us may have received is to do with numbers, and number 11, saying things like New York has 11 letters, Afghanistan has 11 letters, George W. Bush has 11 letters, and reading some kind of premonition into the number 9 and into the number 11. And there were vast amounts of this kind of material created, this kind of conspiracy theories that I started looking at and attending to in a certain way. And in some ways, this number 9 and number 11 then became a kind of obsession to kind of travel back through them, not into the territory of myth where some of this were calling us, but into the moment of history. And it took me to the moment of September 11th, 1893, which was the first Parliament of Religions, the first sort of global congregation of faiths, at a time when it was prior to the world wars and prior to the whole idea of nations annexing each other, and in some ways locating the potential for future global disquiet within the notion of faith. And that sort of interested me, this overlay of the same date but separated by 108 years. The other kind of paranoia that was being put out simultaneously and immediately after 9/11 was this sort of rainbow-colored threat coding system that the American Homeland Security put out, which marked the daily threat potential of what one might encounter. And interestingly, since the moment of its inception until now, a couple of months ago when it's being removed from actual usage, it's never gone down below an elevated state of threat. And it's always remained in that register of severe, high, and elevated. And this, again, another kind of paranoia that states were putting out became another obsession. So this project, which it's a solo show that's currently on at the Art Institute of Chicago, actually cites some of these moments. And the core of this piece called Public Notice 3 is essentially a speech delivered by an Indian religious leader called Swami Vivekananda, on the morning of September 11th at the Parliament, calling for a certain kind of universal coming together through a death of fanaticism, end of fundamentalism, end of intolerance, bigotry. And these were words rendered on that morning, which somehow seems to resonate and be applicable in the kind of dialogue and rhetoric that surrounds the notion of global threat. So as one, the piece actually is within every riser of every step. So one actually reads the text as one ascends, and the words are randomly sort of split in these 5 colors, refracted in this sort of coding system that the state, American state, put out. So one kind of reads as one ascends, but as one kind of descends, it becomes almost like a film of the coding system's light that sort of falls on every step. The location of the museum was somewhat central to the piece, because this was the space where the Parliament took place. The actual building was evacuated of this auditorium, which hosted the Parliament, and in its place came the grand staircase. So essentially, the work exists today in the very space that the speech took place. In some ways, going back to the memory of that building. The structure of the grand staircase sort of allowed for a certain kind of doubling. So as one comes up from the 2 sides of the steps, the text is essentially the same set of words. At mid-landing, they're again the same set of words doubled, and they're kind of quadrupled as one goes up on the 4 sides, almost like the notion of the echo, which is essentially, the notion of sound from which the words sort of emerged. Also, the context of this encyclopedic museum was really interesting, because from different sight lines, it's almost as if the piece is read through various corridors, whether it's the corridors of European modernism or the corridor of yes, or, for instance, Tibetan art, Japanese art, or for instance, here seen through this figure of the Buddha, and created a possible way in which it becomes part of this thoroughfare within an encyclopedic museum. As the grand staircase is something that one has to navigate to circulate within the building. So I'll end with some of these thoughts, and join Simone later. Thank you.